Hi to everyone. We've got a big crowd today, so I'm going to give it a minute or two and let everyone enter our Zoom webinar space. If you are here for a conversation on a Stanford University murder mystery, you are absolutely in the right place. Oh boy, we have got a big crowd coming in. Okay, this is great. While everyone fills in to our discussion room today, I'm going to get just a teeny bit of bookkeeping out of the way. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us at Alta Live, the digital event series we do here at Alta Journal. I'm Beth Spotswood, Alta's digital editor. Today, I am so excited to welcome author, journalist, and Alta contributor, Julia Flynn Siler. Her most recent book, The White Devil's Daughters, The Women Who Fought Slavery in San Francisco's Chinatown, is a New York Times Editor's Choice, a finalist for the California Book Award, a favorite of ours here at Alta. She is a longtime contributor and former staff writer at the Wall Street Journal, and we are now delighted to say an Alta Journal contributor. Her latest for us looks at the tragic death of Stanford University co-founder Jane Stanford and the mystery of who killed Mrs. Stanford and why. It is in the current issue of Alta Journal. If you're unfamiliar with Alta, we are an award-winning quarterly that celebrates and examines the West. This is our brand new issue. It was released yesterday. It's all about the secret and hidden West. So if you like what you hear today, I do hope that you'll check out more of our work at altaonline.com. Julie wrote actually in this issue a story with quite a headline, A Horrible Death to Die. This is the story of Jane Stanford's life and ultimate murder. So we're going to speak with Julie for about 30 minutes. Please use the Q&A button located right under this video to ask any questions you have for Julie. We're going to get to as many of those questions as we can at the end of our chat. Without further ado, Julie, thank you so much for taking the time to join me today.
Oh, hey, thanks, Beth. I'm so happy to be here and so proud to contribute to Alta. What an amazing issue, this summer issue. Some of my favorite writers are in there.
Well, good, including you, one of ours. Also I see in the chat, we've got a lot of highs from Massachusetts, Palo Alto, Berkeley, Sacramento. Please, I'm in Nevada. Julie, where are you today?
I am in central Marin County.
Oh, we're neighbors.
We're neighbors.
So give us a shout out and let us know where you are. And Washington, D.C. And again, please do use the Q&A button for questions for Julie. So as we kind of get started, I thought this article is brand new. This issue is brand new. I'm hoping that Julie, our kind of resident expert here on Jane Stanford's life and murder, could give us a quick rundown of what happened. And while she does that, I'm going to share, New York City, North Carolina. This is great. I'm going to share my screen and we're going to look at some photos of the people involved in this very true, very tragic story. So bear with me. Here we go. Play from start. All right. Who is this?
Okay, Beth. This is Jane Lathrop Stanford. Now, Jane Stanford was the wife of one of the big four railroad barons, Leland Stanford Sr. And she was also the mother of Leland Stanford Jr., her one and only child, who she gave birth to in her late 30s, only child. She was devoted to her only son. And this is just such a tender photograph of the two of them. And he was a very unusual, very precocious young man. And by the time he was born, the Stanfords were very wealthy. The Stanfords traveled Europe quite a bit. And on one of their grand tours to Europe, Leland Jr. Contracted typhoid fever, and he died very tragically at the age of 15. And that, of course, was a heartbreaking turn of events for Jane and for her husband, Leland Sr. And they decided that they would found a university on the grounds of their Palo Alto farm, which was their horse farm, about 8,000 acres, more than 8,000 acres in Palo Alto, in memorial to their dead son. This is a photograph of the two of them. I think this is a railroad photograph, actually,
No,
not
this
a.
is the quad. This is the first.
Oh, is it? Okay, I'm sorry, I didn't even know that. All right, so this is decided to start this university in 1885. The university opened in 1891, and that was the same year that Leland Sr. became a U.S. senator. And so Leland is off in Washington, D.C. And in fact, what happened was that Jane ended up doing a great deal for the university in terms of its planning. And you have to keep in mind that Leland Sr. goes to Washington to become a senator. 2 years later, 1893, he dies. And so all of a sudden, Jane is not only the person who inherits what appears to be an enormous estate, the Stanford estate, but she inherits this at a time when the US is suffering a terrible financial downturn. And there are all kinds of confluence of pressures on her, not the least of which was the US government suing the Stanford estate for debts that it owed, they claimed it owed them. So anyways, one of the first things that both Jane and Leland Sr. did before Leland Sr. passed away was hire this man. And his name was, oh God, I'm always mixing, it's terrible. This is the first president of Stanford University. Yeah, David Starr Jordan, sorry about that. And he's looking very formidable there. And he was an ichthyologist. He was somebody who studied fish. That's how he made his name as a scientist. They hired him from the University of Indiana, and he came in and really executed Mrs. Stanford's, for the most part, her vision of what the university should be, as well as Mr. Stanford for the short period in which he was alive. So just to get us back up to 1893, Jane is a widow now. David Starr Jordan is the president of Stanford University. And as time progresses and Jane faces down a series of challenges while heading an all-male board of trustees, David Starr Jordan is involved with recruiting faculty, and many of the faculty and people he brought to the campus were people he had known from Indiana University, where he had worked before he was hired at Stanford. Fast forwarding, we're up to the turn of the 20th century, and Mrs. Stanford and David Starr Jordan are increasingly coming into conflict with each other. Mrs. Stanford is determined to keep on building out the campus and to realize her and her husband's plan for what this campus should look like. And David Starr Jordan, in turn, wants to keep on hiring more faculty and raise faculty salaries. And they're conflicting on all kinds of large and small things. This is a letter from 1903 in which Mrs. Stanford is writing to David Starr Jordan involving, I think, is it door stops? I think so. Yes.
Door checks.
Door checks.
An old-timey word for doorstop.
Yeah.
It costs $3.
Cost $3. So she was very, very detail oriented. And there was an effort to have Mrs. Stanford step back, certainly on the part of David Starr Jordan. He did not want this level of micromanaging. And in turn, she did do a fair amount of traveling. So let's go to the next slide, Beth, if you can. And here comes another character entering the picture. This is Bertha Berner. And Bertha Berner was hired by Mrs. Stanford shortly after shortly after Leland Jr.'s death as her private secretary. And one of her first jobs was to helped Mrs. Stanford write condolence or return letters of condolence that the couple had received on the death of their son. Now, Bertha Burner never married, and she spent an enormous amount of time with Mrs. Stanford and traveling with her. She also had a separate relationship with David Starr Jordan, and there are letters in the Stanford archives and other places that are very intriguing and suggest they may have known each other a bit more than perhaps was publicly known at the time. So, and as you can see, Bertha Burner is quite a bit younger than Mrs. Stanford and was quite attractive too.
Yes.
Yes,
Bertha, kind of defeating the stereotype of the name, is quite gorgeous.
yes, yes, indeed. And Mrs. Stanford treated her very, very well. She bought her a house in Palo Alto, a house that in fact is still standing. And I'm sure that people from Palo Alto can tell us more about that. And she lived there for a long time with her brother and with her mother.
Is that the
So
house?
I think this is the back of the Stanford mansion, one of the Stanford
That's quite
mansions.
a house.
Yeah, quite a house.
All
Let's go
right,
to
so
the
we
next
go
one.
next. So we're kind of, I mean, right here, we're gonna jump into the drama between Mrs. Stanford and President Jordan, and kind of what has led Mrs. Stanford to relax, escape to Hawaii.
Yes, yes. So let's fast forward now to the early part of 1905. So at the beginning of the year, Mrs. Stanford, Jane Stanford, was at her Nob Hill mansion. She was nursing a very bad cold. She goes to bed, but before she goes to bed, she takes a sip of Poland water, and she immediately realizes it tastes bitter, and she knows that she's been poisoned. And that was confirmed later by a analysis of what was in the water. So then Bertha Burner, who was there at the time, and Mrs. Stanford traveled both to the peninsula and to San Francisco, because on the advice of counsel, they thought it was wisest to flee the Nob Hill mansion. And then eventually decided that the wisest thing would be to go to Hawaii and get as far away as possible from the terrible event that just happening, the poisoning attempt. So they get on a steamer, they make it to Hawaii, and they arrive at this very grand hotel, which is in Waikiki. It's the Moana Hotel. And they check into their rooms. They have separate rooms, and they have all kinds of ventures planned, and it's very, very lovely. In the evenings, they enjoy Hawaiian music, and it's a very relaxing place. And one day they had a special treat planned, and they were going up to what was known as the Pali in Honolulu. And that's kind of the cliff area that sits way above in the mountains above Waikiki. And they take carriage up there, and they have a picnic, and they eat gingerbread. And it's a lovely day. And they come back around, they get back about 4 o'clock. They have an early supper. They go to bed. Mrs. Stanford puts a little bit of bicarbonate of soda or some sort of white powdery compound into a glass of water to settle her stomach before bed, which was her habit. And shortly thereafter, she realized that she had been poisoned again. And by just about midnight in February, the end of February 1905, Jane Stanford is in agony. She is suffering terribly, and then she dies. And an inquest, doctors are called. There's a doctor at the hotel. An inquest, coroner's inquest, is held very quickly afterwards. And the coroner absolutely definitively said she died of strychnine poisoning. Soon after, Stanford's president arrives on a steamer. And slowly, slowly, the story starts to change. And all of a sudden, the mainland newspapers start reporting that Mrs. Stanford died of a natural death, or perhaps she ate too much gingerbread, or perhaps she overexerted herself. And so there's an incredible kind of pivot that takes place in how the public views how Mrs. Stanford died. And just to step back for a moment, right before COVID hit, I went to Waikiki and I visited the hotel and I saw the room.
This is the
Here we
room.
go. Here's the room. Of course, it's all been refurbished
This
since.
is a pretty small room, though, for the likes of, I would certainly not complain, Moana Hotel. But this, for, I would imagine, Jane Stanford, a famously wealthy woman of her day, this is a modest room, I would guess.
I thought so too. I was really, really surprised by it. And not only that, it doesn't face the ocean. It faces the interior. It faces the mountains. So there were a few surprises in the room, but it was just wonderful to see the hotel and see the setting. And I also, of course, went to the Hawaii State Archives trying to track down original documents. Here is the register at the Moana Hotel that shows guests in every single day. I don't think they had the book opened that day to Mrs. Stanford's visit. But I also went to the Bishop Museum and tracked down information about both the Moana and what Waikiki was like in 1905. And I was trying to track down this crazy rumor that I'd heard when I was researching my book, Lost Kingdom, which is a book about the history of 19th, early 20th century Hawaii. And there have been rumors for years that there was somebody kind of in the archival world of Hawaiian history who had a document that would somehow prove who killed Jane Stanford. And so that's why I was in Hawaii. I was trying to track this down. And you know, over the years, I've gotten to know a fair number of folks in the history world in Hawaii. So that was my goal. And let's go to the next slide if we've got one.
We kind of end with Stanford today.
Stanford today, still known as the farm, as Stanford graduates know. And you know, and it's such an interesting place. I went and I tracked down the very kind of mournful statue of Jane kneeling as her son sits and her husband stands. And it's interesting to reconceive this university really as being a memorial to a boy who died at 15.
Mm.
And the ghosts that linger. In fact, I think maybe Halloween, I'm not sure, but there's a long time Stanford ritual. I'm sure that somebody on this call will know about that, but of going to the crypt. And people have reported interesting senses of the ghosts that still haunt Stanford University.
That was a very great and admirably brief kind of explanation of the story. So I'm going to we're getting a lot of questions. Let me dive right in. But the first is, you know, I was going to ask what attracted you to this story, but it's very clear. This is kind of an incredible story. And there are a number of people, and have been for quite some time, who are on a quest to try and figure out the truth. Can you talk a little bit about how Stanford students, Stanford professors, other historians are starting to both acknowledge that David Starr Jordan's attempt to make everyone believe that she died of gingerbread was complete baloney, and help prove that not only was Jane Stanford, but find out who she was murdered, or was Jane murdered, but find out who she was murdered by and why.
Absolutely. So, Beth, you're right. A lot of the most interesting work has been done by people at Stanford itself, and probably the biggest, most explosive breakthrough took place in 2003, 2004 by a retired neurologist who broke the story, confirming that she died of poisoning, and that was a huge story. However, institutionally, Stanford dealt with it in a very kind of delicate way, I would say. And there were people within the institution who continued to feel that there were a lot of doubts and a lot of questions about it. Meanwhile, the most kind of interesting group that's been looking into it has been led by the very eminent historian Richard White, American historian of the American West. He led two classes 2 seminars for freshmen about, the title of these seminars was Who Killed Jane Stanford? And he had these super bright kids going through the archives trying to look for clues, which is fantastic. That said, they didn't appear to discover anything shocking. But Richard White himself might have. We'll have to wait and see what he comes up with. And
So Richard's White book claims to offer an answer to who the murderer is and why. But
yes,
it's still kind of, as it stands now, it's not settled.
right,
So one of the questions we're getting here is, who are the likely suspects? And I'm going to
right.
start, there's with David Starr Jordan. We saw one of the, I can only imagine one of dozens, if not hundreds, of messages from Mrs. Stanford to President Jordan saying, hey, $3 for doorstops. I don't think so. She was on a mission to oust him as the school's president. And the night before, or the evening, I guess, before the first poisoning attempt, she had met with the board of trustees and asked for his removal, correct?
Well, we don't know if she asked for his removal, but there are hints that she did based on some letters a few weeks before. We don't know exactly what happened in that trustee meeting. So we'll see.
But
I
the
mean, it's a
next
good
day,
guess. The next day she was poisoned. So who are the leading culprits?
and
Let's go to that. Let's go to that question.
yeah.
This was a period of enormous anti-Asian sentiment. So at the time, the fingers pointed to what was then known as the Chinese houseboy, which of course is a very derogatory term. And, that's where fingers were pointing then. I think nowadays, I certainly, and the Stanford students involved in that seminar, would look more closely at Bertha Berner, who benefited from Jane's death. She received an inheritance from her. She was showing signs of feeling oppressed by her longtime employer in a lot of different ways. And she was the only person who was there at both poisoning attempts. So Bertha Berner is a very leading suspect in all of this. And now, did she have an accomplice? Did somebody help her? Was she egged on by the president, Stanford president? I don't know the answer to that. Certainly, also, the president had extremely strong motive for ousting her, as you mentioned, Beth. I mean, Jane Stanford wanted to remove him from his position. And in fact, with her death, he ended up staying in the job till 1911. So he did very, very well. All of a sudden, he has much more control, and he's not getting letters, about doorstops and stuff anymore.
And
So what
he
do you think?
was, I think it was Bertha and David Starr Jordan in cahoots. But David Starr Jordan, let it be known for all of Alta Live and history, was a deeply problematic person. Aside from this, potentially he helped or orchestrated the murder of Jane Stanford. But he was a eugenicist.
Yes,
He
a
described women as,
misogynist.
he was a just a garbage misogynist. Um, how he described women as inherently unoriginal. I wonder, when we look at Jane Stanford's legacy, what role gender played in the way that she was perceived at the time as, Leland Stanford orchestrating and funding things is one thing in the late 1800s and early 1900s. His wife coming in with opinions and orders and directives of her own was entirely another. It would be today. What do you think that, her gender played any part in the way she was treated by the board of trustees, treated by the president, and ultimately impacted her death, which
Well, I
could lead
think
to
this simple answer is yes. Her gender played a big role in the pushback she got and the lack of respect she got. And there are lots of letters in the archives in which trustees and others criticized her. Whether the criticisms are valid or not, I don't know. Stanford archaeologist and cultural historian Laura Jones thinks to this day there's been a lot of misogyny that has surrounded our understanding of Jane Stanford and her contribution to the early history of the university. And if you look at the early history books, like the definitive history of Stanford University, you won't find very much about Jane Stanford there. Why is that? Well, victors write history, don't they? And Jane Stanford, in this case, was a murder victim. She was the exact opposite of a victor. And it was Jordan who was writing the history with his, the folks that he had hired. So I will leave it like that. I think gender played a very important role. And I also think that it's, it's really interesting. We're in this kind of liminal moment right now when we're starting to re-examine institutional histories. I would say Stanford just renamed a portion of its campus Jane Stanford Way in honor of her. And that's, more than 100 years after she co-founded the university. So that's long, long overdue.
And they're removing Jordan's name from halls and courtyards.
That's right.
Not necessarily because he is a suspected murderer or murder accomplice, but because of the eugenics, the overall misogyny that I think he could kind of blow off. There was a professor who had an inappropriate relationship with a woman who worked in the library, and the guy who reported it was fired, as opposed to the professor who was, clearly a different time. But Jane Stanford was onto this and wasn't having it. We're getting a lot of questions. After the first poisoning attempt, was there an investigation into who did this? Jane seems to have kind of been like, I'm out of here, I'm going to hotels, and now I'm making my way to Hawaii. But were the authorities involved in trying to look into who tried to poison that Poland spring water?
Yes, there was an investigation, but it didn't lead very far. And Jordan was accompanied to Hawaii with one or two detectives. They were private detectives. And these private detectives, arguably, their jobs were to bury evidence versus to dig up evidence. So there's a lot of questions about the role of the police and the role of the detectives in this. And perhaps they were not acting in Jane's interests in the way that they were going about their business.
David Starr Jordan had experience with strychnine. He was not unfamiliar with this method. Was strychnine used in both poisoning attempts, the unsuccessful and then the successful one?
Yes, it was used in both attempts, and he did have experience with this. In his role as a fish scientist, one of the ways he would collect fish was to use strychnine to poison them, and that made it easier for him to scoop them out of the water. And Lulu Miller, who I just loved her book, Why Fish Don't Exist. She spent 10 years examining Jordan, and she came up with this, but she never really could, definitively say, was he a murderer? Was he involved in Jane Stanford's murder? She wasn't quite sure. But there's certainly some evidence that Jordan was familiar with this chemical substance.
This is a broader Stanford question, but it's one we're getting a couple of times, and I think it's a great one. If Jane Stanford had been successful in ousting Jordan, if she had cheated death, basically, and turned the university into a more traditional liberal arts institution, would Silicon Valley exist as we know it today?
Such a great question. Such a great question. I don't know for sure. Perhaps not. It's like a parallel universe. What would have happened? Are there any novelists out there who can tackle this? I think this is a perfect story for a novelist to look at. And perhaps, think of Silicon Valley. Think of it, still the valley of, Valley of Delights with plum tree blossoms, and people reading novels. Who knows? It could have been a different place.
Why is this story so unknown? It seems to have kind of emerged only in the past 2 decades, I'm guessing.
Yeah.
Stanford's magazine has a story on who killed Jane Stanford, and I know a number of professors and freshman students have been working on kind of they've tried Bertha in absentia. Um, but was there anything that prompted this kind of willingness to discuss, to re-examine Jane Stanford's death, admit that it was murder, admit that there's an uglier history to Stanford University than anyone would, hope to believe?
Absolutely. The what kicked this off was not the alumni magazine article, which was based on the very slim book that was titled The Mysterious Death of Jane Stanford, published in 2003. And that was by that neurologist. So he kicked this all off. Now, how he got interested in it, I'd have to look back through the book to try to track that down. Unfortunately, he died right after it was published. But that's what really set the ball rolling. And, imagine it was like 100 years after she died that people within the institution decided to take a closer look at it. I would also say that it's perhaps no coincidence that a general examination parallels an interest in women's history, an interest in looking at the history of people who haven't, the non-victorious versus the victors. And so perhaps that's why there's more interest in Jane Stanford's murder.
There's an interesting point made in the Stanford University article, I think it's from 2003, Who Killed Jane Stanford, that she took on her role as Stanford's main benefactor and saved it from financial ruin. She kept it afloat. When her husband died, she was encouraged to shut down the institution altogether. That this became her child. This became her baby. And she put all of the love and the passion and the mourning that she had for the loss of her son into this. And, you and I were speaking earlier, as moms, I get that. And I really feel for Jane. I think that Jane got a bad rap, as often women in history who had really strong and perhaps controversial opinions and went up against men who thought that they were very smart and smarter than women, certainly, had done. Is there something that we need to know? Is there something that you want us to know about Jane Stanford, or kind of rethink the way we look at Jane Stanford and her legacy moving forward?
Well, I think it's, first of all, she is arguably one of the West's most important people, and not just women, I would say people. She made a huge difference in the way the history of the West unfolded, through her involvement and her decision to keep Stanford University open and going at a time when, as you point out, Beth, her advisors were saying, just close it. You've got too much on your plate right now as a new widow. She refused to do that. And the rest is history. We have Stanford, we have Silicon Valley. I mean, maybe that's a little grandiose to lay that at her feet. But she was very, very important. And I think there is a great opportunity, and going forward, there are historians who will look more closely at her contribution. There's already a very good biography by Catherine Pike. I'm sure we'll see more in the future about her contribution. She was not a perfect person by any means. She was highly imperfect, and very complex. She, she went to seances. She believed in the afterlife in a very 19th century Victorian ghostly way that is hard for us to understand today. That said, a woman, I'm fascinated by the subject of women exerting power and what happens. I mean, in this case, early 20th century, she was killed for it, arguably. I mean, we don't know exactly why she was killed, but we can make some pretty good guesses. And it appears that she was trying to exert power by firing Jordan, and she was killed for it. So we'll see. Maybe it was something else. I look forward to finding out.
Okay, a few more questions as we run out of time. Many people want to know, will you be writing a book about this?
Well, thank you for asking that question. I don't think so, but I'm very honored that you asked the question. I think that I have got another project which is also important. It involves somebody, a woman who had a huge influence in the West. So I'm going to focus on that
Are
project
you allowed to
instead.
tell us?
No, not
Okay,
yet. Thank you, though.
fair enough. Okay, well, let Alta know, please, when you're ready.
Yes.
What are there any other, aside from, we have the house servant, the Asian house servant was the initial kind of suspect. We have David Starr Jordan potentially in cahoots, my theory, with Bertha, both because David Starr Jordan was across the Pacific when poisoning number 2 happened. And I really don't see this guy thinking he's the most important person to ever have graced Silicon Valley with his presence, sneaking through someone's mansion himself to do the dirty work. Are there any other suspects other than the ones we've mentioned?
Let's think who else it could be. There was a maid who was fired after the first poisoning attempt, but she was not there for the second poisoning attempt. They hired a new maid for the trip to Hawaii.
And it would have to be someone, I mean, especially in Hawaii, I assume that at the Stanford mansion in Nob Hill, there were a number of servants, domestics that, could have, I don't know, been bribed to do whatever. But in Hawaii, to have taken that motive across the Pacific, it really narrows down our suspects. So a second secretary or a second maid came in addition to Bertha and Jane.
Yes.
Was there anyone else in their party? Could someone from the Moana Hotel have been coerced?
Absolutely, someone from the Moana, and there were Stanford graduates and Stanford connections in Honolulu at that time. Jane would go to Honolulu to meet with alumni of Stanford, which had been open for about a decade at that point. So that's possible. Who knows? The private detective agency that was, I just don't know. It's really interesting. I can't wait if somebody, finds out more, such as Richard White. I can't wait to find out.
We're going to find out the details, everyone, on when Professor White's book is coming out. It's not yet available. In fact, we invited him to join us, and he said his publisher prefers that he not. So the primary evidence, James asks, the primary evidence implicating David Starr Jordan in a conspiracy is his actions to overturn the verdict of the original Honolulu coroner's inquest.
That's correct.
And he went to some trouble.
Yes, he did.
To change everyone immediately saying, oh my God, she was poisoned, to suddenly, you know what, she had a lot of gingerbread at that picnic. In fact, Jordan somehow persuaded 4 out of 5 on the medical panel, including the chief coroner, to change their verdict to heart attack. Does that implicate him? One could argue that implicates his, hey, guys, it wasn't poison because I poisoned her, or trying to protect Stanford's reputation of, we don't have murdered people running.
Absolutely. And you could see it from his perspective. You could see he was doing his job to protect the reputation of the institution. And what does it matter anyways? Well, it kind of matters to her family, I would think.
Her family didn't really fight. Her family didn't, from what I could find in your article and the other ones I had read about this, her family didn't seem to put up that much of a stink about the poisoning versus gingerbread. Why is that?
I don't know the answer to that either. That's a mystery to me.
Was she close? Was she close with her, I don't know, brother? Who's around?
Yeah, she had a brother who she was very close to, who was essentially the business manager at Stanford. And her family also benefited from her death, in that, she did leave behind a fortune. So it's unclear. It is unclear, and it may be they chose to keep it private. Um, they didn't want to be in the papers any more than the family had already been in the papers. You know, she, Jane Stanford, was one of the most famous women in America at that point. Um, and it didn't look good for the reputation of the family or for the institution to prolong talk of her being murdered in such a kind of ghastly way. I guess any kind of way is ghastly, but this was particularly
This
ghastly.
was pretty bad. Whatever happened to Bertha?
Bertha continued to live in Palo Alto for a very long time. She wrote uh, about her experience, about 20 years later, about her experience of working for Jane Stanford in a memoir, which most historians believe is highly unreliable. I would agree with that. Um, and she was treated by Stanford University as an institution as an honored guest. I mean, she
Oh,
would show
wow.
up at events, and she continued to write and apparently have some sort of relationship, at least a correspondence with David Starr Jordan. So she was very much an honored member of the community. And it's interesting that the circumstance of the death didn't seem to really change her. I mean, if anything, her life vastly improved once Jane Stanford died. So again,
Hmm.
another reason why it might have been Bertha.
Who do you think did it?
It's hard to see anybody other than Bertha doing it.
But do you think Bertha was prompted by?
Yes, somebody else. So I think Bertha, um, I don't know anything about her romantic life. I am guessing she may have had financial problems. I believe that she had a brother who perhaps was problematic, and there's some indication of that. And so maybe somebody, I don't know who would have been, somehow was able to lean on Bertha and convince her or encourage her to do this.
And Jane was not particularly a laid back boss, I imagine.
I don't think so. I mean, she had a lot of health complaints later in life. She, it must have been really, really hard to be around her, 18 hours a day or however long Bertha was on duty. I would imagine that that would come to seem like a nightmare to somebody after a while, but maybe not. I don't know. On the other hand, Bertha went to see places like Egypt and the pyramids in Egypt and India that she never would have seen unless she was working for Jane Stanford.
Sure, sure. Do you think we're ever going to know for
I
sure
I think there's a chance we will know. Absolutely.
with
I
like
think
concrete proof?
concrete proof?
Justice
Ugh,
for Jane. Will
just
Jane get her justice?
okay, let's start this campaign. Justice
I've
for
got
Jane.
shirts coming with an Alta logo.
Yes. I'm all on board for that.
Um, Julie, this is so interesting. I want to say it's fun, but it's not because someone was murdered. But it really is the twists and turns and glamour of this mystery. It's very, very Agatha Christie, right here in San Francisco, Silicon Valley, over to Hawaii. I did the earrings for this. It's
And
really
you look gorgeous.
thank you. It's a fascinating story. And again, everyone, it is in the current issue of Alta, which you can find on newsstands right now and really dive into A Horrible Death to Die. It's also on Alta's website. We're going to email that to you. Links to everything we talked about, including those book titles, Julie's article in Alta. She's written other fabulous articles for us, so we're going to share those as well for you to check out. Next week, we're going to talk about Red Light Lit, a reading series of erotic, work exploring sexuality. And so we've got the organizer of that, as well as the author who wrote about it, Anita Felicelli, for our current issue of Alta. And after that, we've got Michael Schwab, the artist who designed our current issue, from his studio. So please stay in touch with Alta Live if you had fun today, and learned something and were intrigued by this discussion. We're so grateful to all of you for coming and participating. I am very grateful to Julia Flynn Siler. Thank you, thank you, thank you so much. I hope you'll come back for your next story.
Oh, absolutely. Thanks, Beth.
And everyone, take care and stay safe, and check your bottled water. It's factory sealed. Take no risks. Take care, everyone. Bye.